The first one is reader response theory. So, the reader response theory is just the concept that when you read a text, you are connecting with it. And that's when real reading happens. If you've taken foundations of reading, we talk about the difference between real reading and fake reading. And fake reading is when anyone can just read words and sound like a good reader. But real reading happens when you actually interact and connect with the text. Just keep in mind that a single text can be interpreted differently from reader to reader. So it doesn't matter if you've read a chapter book or a picture book or a poem, our life experiences are always at play. And so when I read something, I'm going to bring my life experiences as I am thinking about the text and connecting with it. And the kid sitting beside me is reading it and bringing his life experiences as he connects with the text. And so it doesn't matter if you're 40 or 20 or 6 years old, your life experiences will impact the way that you connect with text. And that's what reader response theory is all about. And as the teacher, we're just saying we understand that and we encourage that in our students and we ask them to actually be explicit in thinking about it so that they can understand why texts impact people differently. And that's why when you read something that you just, it's like, oh my gosh, everybody's got to read this, or I want to tell other people about this. It's because you connected to it on a personal level. The next person that you share it with may or may not feel the same way. Okay, so just a simple example is if I read a book about someone who has cancer, I am coming to that now at this point in my life, knowing that my father had cancer and ultimately he lost his life because of that disease. So when I read about cancer, I'm going to feel very differently about it, no matter what the story is, because of my life experience, as compared to someone who maybe someone has had a family member with cancer, but then they didn't die from it and they got better or they got better and they went into remission. And then it's going to be even different for a person who has not had a direct family member impacted with that disease. So that's just a simple example of what I'm talking about when we are adjusting reader response theory. It also includes the fact that we are always telling our students that there's really two main purposes whenever you read a text. One is called efferent reading, and that is just the fancy word for you read something to gain knowledge. And then aesthetic reading, which is for the enjoyment aspect of it, meaning you might read about other people or their experiences and living vicariously through that and thinking about how people feel. But you can also just read something like very much like a textbook. I am reading this to learn this. And that is more of the efferent reading. We try to teach kids that you can actually do both of these things at the same time. But to think about that every time you come to a text, it's not always with the same purpose in mind. Sometimes it's for school or for an assignment or just because you want to better yourself in that knowledge area. And sometimes it's just purely for enjoyment. And you want to think about that. Also, you just want, this is different from saying like author's purpose and that kind of thing. All right, I'm sorry, I'm going to sneeze. Excuse me. Some of the next terms are going to be terminology I hope that you probably remember from high school or elementary school, but I want to make sure I go over them. And these are the ones that we want to make sure that we are teaching as well in our classroom. The first thing is plot. With that one, we're just talking about when the events of a story and the sequence in which they are told. And then I have there this note, like up the plot of something that you read is the most important element of a fictional story because everyone just wants to read a good story. They want to hear a good story, they want to read a good story. And so you know some people who are really great storytellers and it has to do with like how they tell the story and the order they tell it. They leave you hanging or wanting more or wanting to hear the end of their story. And it's the same thing when we write something. Also, just think about the fact that it doesn't always mean that something is a beginning, middle, and end, right? We've all probably seen a movie that has a structure where you start watching it and then suddenly you get into it and you realize that what you were watching first was actually a flashback. or what you were watching first was the end of the movie and now someone's going to go back and retell the story. So a lot of times the plot is first, second, then this, then that, and finally. But it can also be in different ways. But the whole point is it's how you tell the events in the story and how you tell it in what sequence and order. There has to be a conflict in a good story. And that is a lot of times what we say the plot is. It's the conflict in the story. And it can come from a variety of sources. So as I go through these, I want you to think about books that you've read or movies that you've seen. And you'll probably find that everything falls into one of these 4 categories when it comes to the conflict. You either have a story where it's like person against self. So the main character is dealing with an internal struggle of some kind or trying to get over a fear that they have. It can also be person against nature. So those are the stories when, there's been a natural disaster or something's happening. Makes me think about the book Hatchet. Brian is dropped into, the wilderness and he has to survive. So that's person against nature. Conflict can also just come from person against person. Love Ruby Lavender is a great example of that because it's all about Ruby and Melba Jane. There's a lot of person-to-person conflict. And then kind of the broad one is person against society. And that's when someone is trying to overcome some societal expectation or stereotype that is currently happening that, puts them in an unfair advantage usually. So the most important thing to realize is that the conflict can be one of these or all of these, right, in a story. So I go back to Hatchet. He's dropped in the wilderness and he is definitely person against nature, but it's also person against self because he has to have this internal struggle that he's trying to overcome. I'm sure you can think of other stories where it is person against society and also person against self. But just realize the conflict and the plot of a story is critical for it to be something that a reader can really resonate with. And then be able to identify what types of conflict are in the story. Okay, of course, the characters are just the actors in a story. The setting is important because a lot of times when we think about setting, we just think where the story happens. So we say, it happened on the farm or it happened at a school or whatever. But it's also when did it take place? So I think we forget to teach kids that sometimes. A lot of times we just focus on setting as the place itself, but it also is important to think about like the time period or even the time of day. Like, was this story at nighttime? Or, was the story on a weekend or was it over a month? So make sure you're teaching where and when. Theme is one of the hardest literary elements to teach kids, and that's because it gets confused with main idea a lot of times. Theme and main idea are not the same thing, okay? A main idea is like, I can tell you this is what this story is about. The theme is kind of more like the underlying meaning or significance of a story. It's not like, it's kind of what I call the so what, right? Like, so what? Why did somebody write this story? What do you think is the author's purpose in sharing this story? Not just telling me what was the main idea of the story, but like what's important about it. And so you have a lot of times these things are moral, ethical standards, that kind of thing. Like it's about jealousy or it's about perseverance. It's about overcoming something, right? So that's the theme. It's not so much about just saying like, this is what this was about. I can tell you that on almost every standardized test I've ever looked at, there's been a question about theme, and the majority of kids get it wrong because it's very difficult for kids to understand this. So instead, I encourage you to think about like picking some kind of like, think about character traits. So let's say perseverance. And so I might actually emphasize over a couple of weeks this concept of what it means to persevere and to overcome difficulties. And then I might try to find examples of books that show that theme or that trait. And so that's a way to kind of start teaching theme to kids. But it's something you're going to want to become more comfortable with and then be able to teach about as well. A style is the way that an author tells a story. And the way to find out the style of the story is by looking at the words or the types of sentences that are used and how the story is organized itself. One really important way to teach about style is to think about the point of view. So, is a story written by a narrator? Or is it written by the main character? Or is it written by the best friend of the main character? Like, it's all about perspective as well. That's the style that the author uses. And of course, a lot of these things, it's very trendy right now to do something different from the norm. And so you're going to see lots of examples as you dig into literature about different styles. Most of all, you just want to encourage a balance of genre and variety in topics, and that's the best way to start seeing different styles. If I only ever read things like Diary of a Wimpy Kid, Captain Underpants, or whatever, I'm just thinking about one style of writing. Instead, we want to try to broaden their horizons and encourage them to read other things as well. I just want to point out that every picture book, of course, it has a cover, but then you'll notice as you look through it immediately, it's also going to have a separate title page on the inside. And on that title page right behind it is going to be the copyright page. That's important because, of course, you can see when the book was originally published, but also if you look closely at a copyright page, it's also going to tell you something about the type of art medium that the illustrator used to make the pictures in the story. And when we are teaching kids about literature, we want to make sure that we're not just talking about authors, but also illustrators and exposing them to different styles and types of illustrations. And so a lot of times on the copyright page, you'll be able to find out was this watercolor? Was this pastels? Was this collage or something else? And I think that's just important to be aware of that so that you can share that and teach that to your students. Also, every single book that is published has what's called an ISBN number, and that's almost like its identification number. The ISBN number is found on the copyright page, so if you look very closely, you're going to see something that literally says ISBN, and then it's going to be a list of numbers. It's usually 9, 10, or 13 numbers depending on the publisher. And that is really important because it's like sole identifying number for a book that's been published. So let's say, for example, if you go look for a book called Snow Day, you'll probably find all kinds of books with the title Snow Day, but each one of them will have their own individual ISBN number. Also, if you look on the back of a book where the barcode is and they scan it to when you're paying for it, you will also find the ISBN number probably on the barcode, maybe sometimes even printed directly on the back cover somewhere. But it is often ISBN comes before it. So it's just important that as someone that is using a lot of literature and being exposed to books, that you know that information. Okay? And lastly, I'm just going to share 3 professional websites with you about where you can learn more about books, because the best way to know what's out there for your classroom is by just digging into literature yourself. We used to be able to just go set ourselves down in the middle of a bookstore like a Barnes and Noble or a Borders and just see what was out there. Unfortunately, those are not as frequently found. Cincinnati has a bookstore called Joseph Beth Booksellers that I highly recommend. They have 2 different locations, one in northern Kentucky and one on the east side. That is one of the best bookstores that's still around. They have a great children's section, and also there's one called the Blue Marble, and I think the Blue Manatee maybe, but you can check that out. But try to find independent booksellers and become friends with them. Also, you can use websites like this. So childrenslit.com, it just reviews a variety of author and illustrators, monthly features, recommended book lists, such and such. That's important. This one called carolhurst.com. She's an educational consultant and she provides book reviews as well as curriculum ideas, lesson ideas, themes. You can find things about themes there and other professional kind of development things for teachers. And this one is kind of most relevant to our Ohio people is the Buckeye Children's Book Award. Every year, the Buckeye Children's picks a children's book of the year and a teen